So what I'll do first, let me first acknowledge country. So I'm speaking from Garawa land, and UNSW main campus is on Bedigal land. And I know other parts of the campus are on other parts of country. So art and design is on Gadigal country. I want to acknowledge elders past and present, and also reach out and pay my respects to Indigenous people that might be in the room, and the younger generation as well. And I want to acknowledge, you know, the inextricable connections to country of First Nations Australians. Now, I guess I'll just quickly introduce myself, and yeah, I can see Michael's acknowledging country from his country. We're all in different places, so please feel free to do that. I like the sharing of where we are on country. So my name's Daniel Robinson. I'm a professor with the Environment Group in the Faculty of Arts, and my role with the Institute for Global Development is the Pacific Academic Lead. With Heather Worth, who's retired now, but we still keep in touch with Heather. We're excited to launch this Pacific seminar series, and what a picture to start with. Thank you to Matt for sharing this amazing picture of Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. And I myself have a project in the Cook Islands, and I'm feeling I'm really missing it looking at this picture. We're going to have a seminar once a month, running up until Christmas, roughly once a month. So it just depends on people's availability. So I'm really pleased to introduce Matt here today. So Matt Blacka is a principal coastal engineer at the UNSW Water Research Laboratory, School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UNSW. And his work focuses on reef-mediated coastlines of the Pacific Islands and covers topics that include coastal zone processes and hazards, coastal management and assessment of climate change impacts. Outside of global pandemics, much of Matt's work is based on field investigation, where he spends his time deployed around the coastlines of the Pacific, in particular the Cook Islands. And so it's my great pleasure to invite Matt to give this first Pacific seminar on coastal hazards and development pressures in the Cook Islands. So thanks very much, Matt. And you can see a few people still streaming in. So I just say, before I completely hand over to Matt, feel free to put questions in the chat and Q&A buttons down the bottom. And we'll obviously have Q&A after Matt's spoken for 20, 25 minutes or so. All right. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm coming to you from UN country down the south coast of New South Wales, so well outside of Sydney's lockdown in that area, but a beautiful part of the world nonetheless. And probably my second favourite part in the world to be, as most people who know me know, is somewhere around the Cook Islands. So I've been lucky enough over the last decade or so to combine the places where I like to spend my time with my work and bring those two things together. And today's presentation is a discussion around some of the coastal projects that I've done, I've been involved with on the island of Rarotonga in the Cook Islands. I probably will speak for a little more, closer to half an hour, I think, Dan, if that's all right, than 20, 25 minutes, but we'll have time for some questions at the end anyway. My talk is going to focus on two key areas of Raro. I'm first going to spend quite a while talking about the north coast of the island, the area of Avarua, and really about the coastal hazards for that area, in particular from cyclones and storm surge, that kind of thing. That'll take up the majority of my talk. And then at the end, I've got a little bit more discussion around more like environmental issues, and that will focus on the area on the left-hand side of this title slide here, which is Muri Lagoon, and some of the environmental challenges there at the moment and over the last decade or so. So I'll jump in and move along. Just get my slides to move. Okay, so for people that are not as familiar with the Cook Islands as I am, or for people that aren't living there, I'm aware we've got some Cook Islanders joining us today, hopefully. The Cook Islands is sort of over in the middle of the eastern side of the Pacific in Polynesia, and it's sandwiched midway between French Polynesia and American Samoa. So it's culturally a little bit different to a lot of the other areas of the Pacific, and it's more closely linked, I guess, through French Polynesia and then the Cook Islands and New Zealand and that kind of area over towards that eastern side. The Cook Islands themselves, the country is really split into two island groups. There's a northern group of islands, which is in this map on the left-hand side here. It's everything above the words Cook Islands, and then there's a southern group of islands. And from a coastal science perspective, they're quite different, and the differences make a big difference to the kind of hazards that they're exposed to. So I've shown some examples here. On the top right, there's the island of Penrhyn or Tongariro, which is a very low-lying atoll and a very big atoll in the northern group. And that's kind of a classic example of a northern Cook Islands type island. And then in contrast to that, in the southern group, the islands tend to be higher, most of them. With the exception of Palmerston, but most of them tend to be higher. The example I've shown there is the main island of Raro that I'm talking about today, which is a higher volcanic island. So quite clearly their exposure to coastal hazards are very different. This slide here just shows you, I guess, in the geological evolution of islands and how they evolve through time, where some of the different Cook Islands sit. And again, this is really important for a coastal science perspective. So we have islands like Raro that are high volcanic islands on the left-hand side there, sitting somewhere between a fringing reef and a barrier reef island. And then if we go to somewhere like Aitutaki, just north of Raro, it's sinking a little bit more in the middle, and it's sort of a partial atoll almost, where the reef is further distant from the main central part of the island. And then you go to a full atoll like Menehiki, which is one of the northern group islands. And then there's also some interesting ones that are a little bit different that are actually raised coral atolls. And that's what places like Mangaia and some of the other southern group islands. So their coastline's quite different. It's actually uplifted out of the water. And so again, that makes a big difference to the exposure to coastal hazards. But that's kind of the spectrum. The Cooks has the whole spectrum of different types of islands, whereas some countries in the Pacific don't have that. They're more focused towards, say, atolls. In terms of coastal hazards, again, I've just listed here some of the relevant ones, and I wanted to just give a bit of background for people that aren't so familiar with what I mean by coastal hazards. And I wanted to just talk about some of the separate little individual bits and pieces that a lot of people group together as a coastal hazard. And it's kind of important to tease out the different drivers and mechanisms for them. But so I'll just start. Really, in my mind, I separate coastal hazards into two areas. The first is things that create flooding from the sea. So that's an inundation type of coastal hazard. The second is loss of land to the sea. So coastal erosion type hazards. That's kind of my way of differentiating them in my mind, at least how they apply in the context of the Pacific Islands. The top right-hand photo here, it's from the Marshall Islands. That's actually a photo of tidal inundation hazard. And tidal inundation, it's not related to storms. It's driven just by the astronomical processes of tide. So this is a king tide event where when you get high tide levels that can come in and inundate the land from the sea. That's quite different from a storm surge event, which is linked to a specific storm event and not necessarily the tides at all. So the central photo on the right-hand side there is Rarotonga on the north coast, and that's a storm surge event from a cyclone. Also, the photos labelled A and B in the bottom of the screen there are from the island of Puka Puka in the northern group of the Cooks, and that's a before and after photo of storm surge impacts on a Taro patch, where storm surge inundation came in and flooded that area. The last photo on the bottom left there is from Niue, and that's purely wave run up and overtopping impact. So that's not storm surge. So as such, the ocean level didn't reach the top of that cliff. That's waves coming up and breaking over the top of that cliff that's caused the damage to the island there. So waves themselves, which can be created quite distant, create their own hazards. Sometimes they're combined with storms in the case of cyclones, but sometimes they can be quite distant. And so we do have some cases where you'll get big swell events coming up and approaching, say, the south coast of Rarotonga or other islands in the Pacific, like Fiji, where the storm event is way down near Antarctica, but the swell will travel across the whole ocean and create these big hazards. But that's separate from a cyclone storm surge event. So this sort of is the spectrum of different types of coastal hazards I talk about from a flooding type perspective. The other is loss of land to the sea, and that's through things like beach erosion, which is storm coming and temporarily taking sand off a beach, and then that sand will probably come back, versus coastline recession, which is a long-term loss of land to the sea. And that can be from things like a change in the sediment transport coming into an area, or through sea level rise, for example. But it's usually a long-term process and a loss of land over long term, not linked with a storm. So that's kind of the spectrum of coastal hazards. The hazards I'm going to be talking about today are mostly related to storm surge inundation, and that's the biggest issue for the north coast of Raro. The area I'm focusing on is Avarua for the local people. It's really an area that stretches from Tupapa through to Nikau in the east and the west, respectively, of the island. And this is probably the main, it's the capital of the Cook Islands, if you like. It's the main CBD and business area. To give you a bit of an idea of what it looks like, and I'll spend a little while pointing out a few features in this slide. This is kind of the lay of the land for that area, looking east to west. There's a few particularly important things to point out. You'll hear me talk about. This area has a fringing reef and lagoon system, which is really runs along the edge here. It's really important for the coastal processes, the shape of that lagoon and these two harbours. That drops away quite steeply. It's a very, Rarotonga as an island is almost like a needle in the middle of the ocean. So that drops into deep water very quickly. This whole area along the coast here is what we would call the storm berm. That whole area is sand and coral rubble that's been pushed up historically by storms coming from the ocean and bringing sediments off the beach and up and building up this area. And so when you look at that now, that whole area has been developed, which immediately raises issues about the location of a lot of that development. Inland of that, there's a low-lying depression area. And that's, we've got areas like Arvitu Swamp down in here, which is quite low-lying, coming down into the back of some of these areas here. I think this is USP campus just in here somewhere. The auditorium, sports field, this taro drain down in here, a taro patch down in here, I think is about 1.5 meters above sea level, to give you an idea. So it's very low lying, this inland area here. Within this capital area of the Cooks, there's a lot of development and a lot of important infrastructure. That's the main international airport right on the coast there. All the island's bulk petroleum stores, so aviation fuel, diesel, all is stored in this little area of the island here. The main international seaport is here. A lot of government buildings throughout this area, tourism, and a lot of residential area throughout this whole fringing bit of coast. So it's a really important piece of coastline in the context of the whole of the Cook Islands. I've covered some of these points, but it's probably the densest residential area in the Cooks. It's the hub of the economy. It's really the engine room in a lot of ways. And even though it's probably not the most tourism-oriented area on Raro, it is the hub in that it's where tourism comes into and leaves the island from, with the airport there. In terms of its exposure to cyclones, it's, when you review the historical cyclone occurrences, the island is exposed to about 11 cyclones a decade on average, but it goes up and down a lot with ENSO. So with during El Nino periods, it's a lot higher, the risk of getting cyclones, and that pushes up to about 15 cyclones a decade on average. And it drops off in La Nina years. So why were we involved with looking at this area? In 2005, the area was hit by a series of cyclones. A lot of them quite high intensity events. Not all of them impacted directly on Raro, but nevertheless, there was at least 3 that caused quite a lot of damage. And so there was this concern that were we starting to see the intensification of cyclones that were going to impact this area, and how is that looking with climate change, and what does all that mean for this stretch of coast, given that it's probably one of the most important stretches in the whole of the Cook Islands. So we needed to know some more about the risks from these kind of cyclone events and what climate change meant for that. Looking back over the last probably 40 years, Cyclone Sally, I use the term TC or tropical cyclone in my slides there. So if you see TC, that's what it means, stands for, it's tropical cyclone. Cyclone Sally in 1987 was probably had the most severe impacts on Raro in the recent probably 4 or 5 decades or something like that. And so it was generally thought that an event of that magnitude was probably about as bad as it would get, but that was kind of an unknown with, what the risk of an event like that or a worse event was. So we wanted to look at what some of the consequences of more severe events might be in the risk profile with that. I'm just going to show you now some information and images looking back through time about how previous cyclones have impacted this area. So I talked about Cyclone Sally being one of the worst ones. As luck would have it, it's probably the only cyclone that the Cook Islands has had a wave rider buoy in to measure the waves on this part of the coast during that cyclone, which was fortunate. So we know that the waves got up to between 8 and 12 meters just off the Avatu coast during the cyclone. The event was about a Category 2 cyclone, so not as severe as some of the 2005 ones, but it did pass much closer. Its track made the impacts more severe. And probably it was mostly the north coast that bared the brunt of it, but impacts were felt on the west and east coast as well. So I'm just going to step around a few places along this north coast now and show you some of the pictures that we've assembled from that event. The first one's in this main Avarua area here. And I've sort of tried to capture where we've had historical photos from the storm. I've tried to capture photos in the same area so we can align them. But to give you an idea, this area in this photo is probably about 3 meters above mean sea level, I think. And the photo on the left there just shows a wave surging through that main CBD shops in that area of Avarua. And again, much the same sort of area for those familiar with it. That's in the main roundabout area of Avarua near Trader Jack's, which is a little bit lower. Looking down at the port area now, this is sort of a modern day photo on the right versus the aftermath of Cyclone Sally on the left there. And so a few things to point out: the inundation in the back area of swamp, but the damage to some of the wharf sheds on the wharf itself was quite severe, and all that storm surge damage that you're seeing there in that photo on the left. Further down the coast towards the west, these are some photos. That area there is actually, I think it was being set up at the time, but that's one of the main bulk petroleum stores for diesel on the island. And to give you an idea, I think this here is one of these bulk tanks, and that's the actual tank, to give you some perspective in real life, that was picked up and moved around by waves. And they were empty at the time. But a lot of, you can see the amount of destruction that the cyclone caused, moving huge objects. More recently, from some of the 2005 cyclones, we're able to go from photos to video. So this is just to the east of the main part of Avarua. I'm not sure how this video will come through over to the Cook Islands, but hopefully for people in Australia, this just gives you an idea of the conditions during one of these cyclone events. This was from Cyclone Mina in 2005, which was a Category 5 event that I think passed just east of the island. But you're seeing the impacts of what we call an infragravity surge passing through the shops and the main CBD area in that kind of thing. This is just east of the main central part of town. So the photo on the top left there is what it normally looks like standing in this shop, and the photo on the right was taken, or the video on the right is from the cyclone event. Again, this is about 3 meters above sea level, and then we cross now to the main Trader Jack's area. The photo on the bottom left is what it normally looks like standing from the steps of the courthouse. And this is what it was like during Cyclone Mina. So the impacts from these kind of events are really quite severe. And I guess this kind of drove our need to have a look at whether these were, what the risk profile of these events were and how much worse could it be, or were these kind of as severe as it will be? What will climate change do for these kind of events? So I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts of our assessment, but because I've got other presentations on that, but to give you an idea, it was about a 1.5-year project under the Pacific Adaptation Strategy Assistance Program with the Australian government in partnership with Climate Change Cook Islands. There were really 4 parts to what we did. It was sort of looking back at the historical context of cyclones and looking at things like those videos and photos that we've just shown you. But there was also a lot of work went into elevation mapping and land mapping of that coastal zone to understand all the features and the role that plays in the coastal hazards and storm surge impacts. There was a lot of modelling to predict storms that had already occurred and being able to reproduce the kind of impacts from them. And then a lot of forwards looking modelling, looking at more severe cyclones and different combinations of cyclone magnitude with sea level rise and different other climate change impacts. That modelling spanned physical wave flume modelling, so scale modelling in wave tanks in our labs. It had computer modelling of waves and storm surge, and it had computer modelling of flood inundation as well. And then the end result being to have a look at the impact, the forecast impacts from some of these events, but also to identify sort of key pathways for adaptation. So one of the interesting things about this area when we first started this project really was having a look at what elevation data existed for the island and what we could use and versus what we would have to collect. And this map here just kind of shows the contours that existed, and it was basically 5-meter resolution. And so what you can see if you have a careful look is you have the coastline here where you have 0 meters mean sea level. The next contour was 5 meters, which basically tracks around the inland road through here. The whole town fairly well sits between the 0 and 5 meter contour. And with this data set that existed, we have no idea of the elevation of any of the infrastructure or town or development relative to things like storm surge levels, mean sea level, anything like that. So this data is probably fairly typical of what exists in many islands and countries of the Pacific. And it's not really suitable for doing an impact-based, detailed analysis of these kind of coastal hazards. So one of our first tasks was to actually measure and map the whole Avarua town. Myself and my colleague did that over about 2 weeks with RTK GPS that predated UAVs, unfortunately, by a few years. So we walked, I think it was many kilometers over the course of a fortnight and collected about 25,000 topographical points throughout the town and extending out to the wave break across the lagoon. It's a lot of work getting that data set together. But when we brought all that together, it basically gave us a complete terrain map when we partnered that with existing contours, existing data sets, and then bathymetric data sets outside of the fringing reef that SPC had. So we were able to build a really good terrain model of the whole coastline, which has been a really useful asset going forwards for other projects as well. Using that, we were able to do, and knowing the shape of the coastline and the details, we went on to do a whole heap of physical wave tank modelling of different storm surge scenarios and wave conditions. I've just shown a few pictures here to get an idea of how this specific coast operates in terms of wave processes during these big storms and what kind of flood levels you can get up to. And we also paired that with a full drainage system model and inundation model, if you like, a computer model. So that picked up all the creeks, all the stormwater channels, that kind of thing, all the terrain of the area, all the flow resistance and that kind of thing, so that we could have a look at how storm surge would move when it started flooding through the, through the main town areas, which areas would be vulnerable and which ones weren't. So the end result is really a set of hazard maps, impact-based hazard maps for the town that identify areas that are vulnerable to things like direct wave impact versus, say, storm surge inundation. So in this area, you've got direct wave impacts in red versus storm surge inundation in the blue areas. And this was kind of this mapping shows the areas we'd expect to be impacted during about a 20-year recurrence interval storm. So there's about a 5% chance each year of a storm of this kind of magnitude. This is probably something similar in magnitude to about what Cyclone Sally was, we think. And we look at the impacts that were received from that event. It's certainly possible and has happened in the past to have a cyclone, something like a 100-year ARI event, which is about a 1% chance each year statistically of happening. That would be something like Cyclone Mina with a direct impact, if you like. So it was very near to that in 2005, but it was a near miss. But if something like that happened, this is about the area that we would expect to be impacted for the town. So the risk profile is very, very high for this area of town. And when I say risk, I'm talking about likelihood combined with consequences, because this is the main CBD area of the Cook Islands as a whole, and it's where a lot of the key infrastructure is. The resulting risk is very high. And we've been able to learn a lot from this kind of hazard mapping, both in terms of the location of development, where it should and shouldn't be, and how to plan better arrangements of that going forward, but also the needs, where the real needs for adaptation are for these kind of events, to build resilience from these kind of events. So just some of the direct learnings for this part of the coast, both, when you look back in historical records and you look through missionaries' logs and that kind of thing, there's stories and evidence of there being cyclones with storm surge that basically cuts all the way through to the inland road of Avarua area, for those that know it. So that's basically the whole inland area of where this inundation prediction extent is here. So it's not surprising that that has occurred historically. It's not surprising that that's what our predictions are showing as well, that there's some consistency there, but it hasn't been seen since the most part of town was as near as developed or had a tourism profile like what the island does now. So the impacts would be much more severe if an event like that happens compared to when it's happened in the past. The other thing that we started to notice was that for something like a 20-year ARI event, like this kind of event here in Cyclone Sally, the damage is really constrained to that foreshore bund that I talked about earlier, that storm berm area right along the coastal strip, whereas there's a tipping point. And once you go to something like a 100-year cyclone, with wave overtopping and the storm surge level, the flood extent increases massively because it gets a lot more into that low-lying inner swampy area of town. And so there's this real tipping point between events that have kind of been seen in the last 30 or 40 years and a much bigger event that probably is overdue for Raro, I would say, in terms of statistics. And that's something that's really important to communicate, is this kind of tipping point context where that storm berm along the coast is breached, and it can happen. Key concerns for us really, in terms of coastal infrastructure, the western end of the airport. There's a photo there from a previous cyclone where waves have exceeded the road and taken a chunk out of the end of the runway. That's certainly a possibility, and that seawall and road area has been breached in several cyclones before. So that's a concern for what that means for the runway. In the middle there, all the bulk petroleum stores for the island are in that little bit of coast right on the immediate foreshore. That in itself, that location is sandwiched between the coast and the terminal building for the international airport. So that arrangement is a concern. For what that could mean, knowing that some of that infrastructure can be mobilised by a big enough storm. We looked at the breakwaters around the main port last year, and again, that key eastern breakwater that's protecting the port from waves is particularly vulnerable to a cyclone. Anything bigger than probably about a Category 2 event would see a lot of that rock armour displace either into the berth or over the wharf. So there's some key infrastructure that is vulnerable, but looking more broadly, there's so many houses and business, and the economic drive of the whole country is from this area that would be impacted in a huge event like this. So it's really important to think about that. And then the safety of people. A lot of the main evacuation hubs in this area, so some of the hostels and some of the auditoriums are in some of the really low-lying areas at the back of town, and there's a chance that some of that at least will be inaccessible but could be inundated as well. So planning for disaster risk management is really important for these kind of hazards as well. And there's some concerns around those kind of things as well. So a number of issues. I guess at the time we finished this project in 2013, I was kind of disappointed with where we had to leave it in our scope, because we identified a lot of the vulnerabilities for the island and potential ways for adaptation, but there was no real mechanism to do anything about these issues. Fortunately, moving forward, with my current work on the island, we're actually looking now at scoping and preparing a project concept for GCF financing to start addressing some of these vulnerabilities for this part of town, but other areas around the coastline of the Cooks in general. And we're looking at these specific kinds of pieces of infrastructure and what can be done to reduce vulnerabilities to them. So even though at the time we weren't able to move forward with anything, it's really pleasing that, 5 years or so on, we are actually able to start putting some wheels in motion to trying to address some of these issues. In terms of the bigger picture, and what does all this mean? There were some really interesting learnings that came out of this project for our team, but more broadly for the coastal science and engineering industry. And I've really categorized them into three areas here. Firstly, the state of science in coastal engineering and being able to evaluate coastal processes and hazards. When we compare what we know about coastlines, say in Australia, compared with these reef type coastlines in the Pacific, the science is absolutely in its infancy for the Pacific and for these reef coasts. So when we look at things like how will the coastline respond to sea level rise, fundamental questions like that, we've had a really good idea about that for decades for our type coastlines in Australia, whereas good work to understand that for these reef islands has really only been starting to happen in the last maybe 3 or 5 years. So being able to understand properly the vulnerability of some of these islands to a rise in sea level is really in its infancy. And it's the same sort of thing with predicting coastal hazards and storm surge impacts and things like that. Somewhere like Australia, we've been able to model wave processes on our beaches and wave erosion and things very well for decades, whereas in the Pacific, we're only just able to do it in recent years. And at the time of this project, some of this work was kind of cutting edge. And I'm pleased to say it's not now. The last 5 years or so has really moved on, but it's only through starting to have a look at some of, like this project and a few other detailed ones around the region that we started to realize there needed to be a lot more work done by industry to get the science up to scratch to be able to do these kind of assessments. The second thing I would say is the available data to drive the decision-making process and the gap between what we have in places like Australia and New Zealand versus what we have in the Pacific. And so, I'll use, for example, the land elevation data that we had for Avarua. It was 5 metre contours. The whole of town is between 0 and 5 metres. So you really need a lot better data than that to do these kind of assessments and understand the vulnerability to things like sea level rise and climate change, coastal hazards, that kind of thing. But in Australia, we fly airborne LiDAR and laser scan our whole coast several times a year at times, and before and after major storms, and we have data accurate to about 100 mil with very high resolution of our whole New South Wales coastline. To put that into context, in the Pacific, most of these islands, there is no data like that at all. The northern group of the Cook Islands, we don't even have any data really to define land elevations. So this gap between data that can help drive some of this decision-making around land use and hazards and risk mitigation is really not there compared to what we have here. And then just the level of risks that places carry in the Pacific from geohazards in general is a lot higher than what is acceptable in places like Australia. Put some of these things in context. If you look at somewhere like Manihiki in the northern group of the Cooks, in 1997, Tropical Cyclone Martin came through this atoll, and it was 19 people killed, basically by storm surge and waves just washing over the greater part of land on the atoll. And it was incredibly devastating on a number of levels, both for industry, but also for population that departed the island permanently because of these kind of hazards. And we really need to be in a position to be able to forecast these kind of things from a coastal engineering perspective. And it's only just now in recent years that we're getting to this kind of impact-based forecasting to foresee how events might impact islands like this. And likewise, you know, Penryn, again, we have no idea of the land levels on islands like this in the north of the Cooks, and probably hopefully in the coming year or two, we will start to get some of that data. But to be able to make decisions around how is sea level rise going to impact some of these atolls. Fundamental things. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes, if I've still got time, I'll be very quick, just to spend a little while talking about a different side of coastal science, if I can. So that was all coastal hazards based, but another interesting part of coastal science that I've had the chance to be involved in Raro is more environmental aspects of coastal science. And so I'm going to shift now from the hazards-based analysis on the north coast down to more environmental issues on the southeastern coast, as shown in this square here. So basically, I'm going to talk about the area in the left-hand side of this picture here. So the middle of this picture is Arvana Passage, but everything to the left of that is an area called Muri Lagoon. And it's a beautiful place in the world for people who are lucky enough to have been there and spend some time there. But it's a place that has some real environmental challenges. To give you an idea of what it looked like when I was there doing field work at times. This is not a postcard. This is actually a photo from one of my fieldwork expeditions. And this is what the place can look like. It's absolutely stunning. It's one of the main tourism draw cards of the whole of the Cook Islands, this area of lagoon. It's an absolutely magic place, and a place that needs a lot of effort put into looking after and maintaining. The lagoon area itself, it's about 3 kilometres long, but it depends what we define as the actual lagoon. The system's probably a little bit bigger than that itself in it as a whole, and about 800 metres wide from the coastline out to the fringing reef. It's really shallow. In some areas, it's probably only 0.5 metre deep. The main lagoon basin in the south is probably closer to 2 metres deep, and it's really complex in terms of the way water moves through this whole lagoon system. It's the flushing is driven by waves, but it's modulated by tides. So it's not like some of our coasts here in Australia where, you know, in our estuaries where the tides go up and down and that brings water in and out of an estuary and flushes, say, some of our lake systems. This is different to that. The flushing is all driven by wave energy breaking on that fringing reef, and that sets up currents that flow through the whole system. So big swell, good flushing, small swell, low to no flushing. And it's all modulated by how high the tide is. This area of lagoon is a sink for, I think it's 4 streams that drain into it from the catchment. And just in terms of what the catchment has, a few features, you can sort of see a defining foothill area here. There's very intense tourism development along this coastal fringe. And then there's agriculture through the back area of the coastal plateau. And then it gets very high and very steep very quickly in here. That's one of the main river systems coming in and draining out through the passage here in the north. There's another one here, and there's a couple of smaller ones in the middle here that drain into it. That's just an idea of the sort of shallow nature of the lagoon and the intensity of development along the foreshore. So this area, as beautiful as it is, it really has some significant environmental challenges, and in particular they've become evident. I mean, it's been known about for decades, but it's become really evident in the last probably 5 to 7 years, and in particular it was really bad earlier this year with algae outbreaks in the lagoon, driven by a number of reasons. That's one of the issues, but I've just shown some photos here that one of my friends, Lara Ainley, took earlier in 2021. showing the extent of algae that is in the lagoon earlier in the year. These kind of events happen for a number of reasons, but it's a combination of environmental drivers and swell and a lack of flushing mixed with catchment inputs from rainfall events and that kind of thing that change the chemistry of the water, and the whole thing sort of kicks itself off into these kind of poor water quality conditions. There's also a lot of sediment coming from the catchment during heavy storm events. These were some pictures that one of my colleagues took when we were over there for field work in, I think it was April 2018, just showing the extent of sediment that comes from the catchment and passes through the lagoon out to sea. So there's a number of issues like that, mostly to do with nutrients and sediment coming into the lagoon. Our work was a part of here at this particular site was a part of a lot bigger environmental investigation to look at catchment inputs, groundwater inputs, lagoon flushing. We were focused on the lagoon flushing component and what we call the hydrodynamics of the lagoon. Some photos on the left there just show from our field work, really looking at instrumentation deployed throughout the lagoon for a period of a few months to measure waves and water levels and all these kind of things, characterize flows and flushing and understand what drives the system, and also some oceanographic work. Photos down the bottom there, they're taken outside the reef, looking at currents and ocean waves and that kind of thing. So that all fitted into a bigger picture project to help understand some of the environmental processes and the issues and causes and all this kind of thing for this site. But really the challenges for Murray, it's a case study where we have strongly competing uses of the lagoon in this area. It's probably the most intense tourism hotspot in all the Cook Islands. There's agriculture, both commercial and subsistence, going on in the catchment, in the lower part of the catchment. Aquaculture, people harvesting things from the lagoon for their own consumption and fishing off the outer reef and the fringing reef as well. A lot of recreational use, both tourism and local people, for swimming, snorkeling, paddling, all those kind of things. And the area itself is of really high environmental significance as well. I mean, it's a coral reef and lagoon, but it's got the only area of salt marsh in the Cook Islands in the northern part of it. There's a whole bunch of things going on environmentally why it's of high value. So there's all these competing issues. The lagoon itself is probably more inherently sensitive than almost anywhere else on Raro, I would say, for the coastal lagoons. And that's from a geomorphological perspective. With these islands, there's little motu, as we call them. It's the only area on Raro that has these motu. That means that it's, and the way the lagoon flushing sets up to drain, it's probably one of the least flushed lagoon areas in the whole of the island. So it has this inherent vulnerability to inputs from the catchment anyway. And the catchment, coastal aquifer and lagoon is all really closely linked. What we've seen, you know, from all the environmental work, and this isn't news, this isn't new news, but what we've seen is really there's several primary stressors acting on the lagoon to cause some of the environmental issues here. And it's things like excess nutrients, excess sediments, and other catchment runoff. You know, it's from things like inadequate sanitation infrastructure. And really the issue's been known about for a long time, but solving these kind of challenges, it's a long-term thing to try and get solutions in place. But the intensity of use, in particular with tourism of the coastal strip, when you align that with the level of wastewater infrastructure, you know, those two things are misaligned. Current agricultural practices, when you know, a nutrient runoff from that, when you combine it with the sanitation issues, infilling of wetlands, all these kind of things, clearing of land, there's a whole bunch of things acting like that. But then the issues sort of fluctuate with other drivers and stressors to give you this episodic lagoon health issues. So that's things like the mid-ocean conditions, the hydrodynamics, the lagoon water temperature, salinity, all those things that in themselves aren't fundamental issues, but they do influence the episodic nature of the issues. Start having trouble advancing my slide here. Okay, so from a project like this and all of our work here, what are some of the learnings? Really, development and use of that coastal fringe in this particular case, the way it's been developed over the last probably 20 years or 30 years, it's unsustainable and it's out of balance with the environmental context, I would say, and knowing the inherent vulnerabilities environmentally for this area, it's not ideal. So while Murray has a specific geographical setting that makes it more vulnerable, it's sort of also ringing alarm bells for issues on other areas of coastline around Raro, in particular the south coast and around Titicaca, where there's also been intense development for tourism pre-pandemic, at least, over the last 10 years. But also some of the other tourism islands like Aitutaki are going to have their own issues as well. So it really these issues need to be resolved, and it needs to be done right from the start, so we don't end up with more situations like Murray around the coastline. The solutions need to span multiple timeframes. As a generalization, sanitation infrastructure is a long-term thing to get that in place to improve it. But land use planning needs to be improved. That's a mid-term thing versus catchment management, which is a lot of that can be done in the short term, and community-based work. So there's time frames over which this kind of thing needs to be implemented. In the context of developing communities more broadly, infrastructure needs to be developed, and environmental controls, and needs to be aligned with growth and sustainable development. And all these things need to happen together. We can't have economic growth and things like tourism proliferating in an area like Murray, and then the infrastructure catching up 30 years later, because by then the ship's sailed, the issues are all there in your face. And that's kind of what's happened at Murray. Whereas this kind of development needs to all happen together and be aligned right from the start. And that's one of the key learnings from this kind of area. So just to conclude, for most Pacific islands, the coastal zone envelopes the whole of an island, or in some cases, the whole of a country. In cases like Raro, certainly the majority of the island up from the ridge to the outer reef is the coastal zone. So that therefore goes without saying that coastal zone issues are inherently tied with the implementation of several parts of the sustainable development agenda. Doing any work in that coastal zone needs to reflect its vulnerabilities and its issues. And a lot of those things stem from natural resource management in that coastal zone area and hazards and issues in that area. So the challenges and learnings in the two sort of case studies I've looked at today, in terms of the SDGs, they're quite relevant. You've got things like creating safe and resilient communities, where you're talking atolls, things like coastal hazards impact food, water supply, all these kind of things. All that is tied together. But definitely safe, resilient communities from the impacts of coastal hazards is a big one. And then looking at places like Murray, the challenge of balancing sustainable economic growth and livelihoods with appropriate infrastructure, sanitation, land management, use of marine resources, all these issues coming together in that intense coastal zone. So really there's a lot of close ties between this kind of coastal science work, both from a hazards and an environmental work, and sustainable development in these kind of Pacific islands, whether it's at the more advanced end of the spectrum like the Cooks and Raro, or whether it's islands that are still a lot more undeveloped and still going through this process. There's a lot of learnings and a lot of close ties between coastal science and sustainable development. So I'll leave it there. Me taki ma'ata to any of the Cook Islanders that have been listening, and thank you to people in Australia. And I just put up there some references of reports and papers where some of this work has been published if people wanted to access it in the future.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We've got a few questions that have come into the chat, and if you want to ask a question verbally, you can also raise your hand. Let me go to one of these first ones here. We've got, I can't see a name, it just says anonymous, but you mentioned that the risk levels are unacceptably high. Has this data been used in resilience or adaptation planning for the Cook Islands? And I guess that's in terms of thinking about climate change exacerbation of storms and things like that, which was basically going to be my question as well.
Yeah, so yes is the short answer. It has been used. There's been a number of projects in recent years that have taken into account this kind of flood hazard mapping that we've done. So that's things like planning for renewable energy solar farm sites. It's things like the airport expansion and that kind of thing have been looking at these kind of issues. that's sort of independent projects, but more so than that, it's definitely being used within the adaptation planning program and the climate change planning program, looking at climate finance for infrastructure development on the island to resolve some of these vulnerabilities. So it's definitely being taken into account for that as well. Probably, I mean, one of the issues with it is it's limited in its geographical scope to that main area, but we are looking to expand that over the coming few years, especially once we get better LiDAR elevation mapping of the whole island, to be able to look at some of these vulnerabilities island-wide for Raro.
Sorry, I was muted. We have another question there, and then we've got a couple of comments from Imogen as well, which I'll come to. The next question was, is there any evidence of loss of biodiversity in the lagoon because of development pressures and urbanisation nearby?
That's a really good question. It's a little bit outside of my expertise and hitting zone. Definitely change in biodiversity, definitely. Whether there's loss as a whole, I'm not quite sure. My feeling is that definitely there will be some species that have been in there previously that aren't, and definitely it's changing in response to those kind of episodes of environmental change in the lagoon. So definitely changes in things like sea cucumber numbers compared to other things in the lagoon, changes in fish, but there's also a lot of other things going on in there. You know, there's a lot of tourism, lagoon cruisers, other things going on that not that they create issues in themselves, but it all changes things and impacts things in certain ways.
Michael's got a similar question to that first one. I don't know if you want to expand on this. He says, I assume your coastal data is shared with government. How has it influenced development plans, particularly as it relates to climate change adaptation?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Climate Change Office was our engagement partner for the coastal hazards work on the North Coast. So it's definitely, the data is definitely there and being used. You know, another example on how it's changed things. I know I can probably try and answer two things with one answer here, two questions with one answer, but I know Imogen has asked about the Waikapuwangi development. Yeah, so it's acknowledged that it's a risk area, and one of the ways that this information has been used in the planning is Waikapuwangi is a big development of government offices and trying to consolidate them into one area, and it is in a vulnerable area of Avarua, but the designs themselves have taken into account the vulnerabilities and the level of storm surge and that kind of thing with the planning to the way those sites are laid out, and car parking on the ground floor, elevated floor levels of buildings and that kind of thing. There's a number of other things driving where that is located and it being in a vulnerable area to do with access to land for government offices and things like that. But definitely it's taking into account these kind of values, and specifically the numbers that have come out from this kind of modelling have been used to dictate floor levels and where needs coastal protection and all of those kind of things, yeah.
Imogen's got another comment / question there. For Murray Lagoon, we believe the situation can be corrected, but it may take 30 years, similar to the time it took for problems to become acute. We have to work with what we have to turn things around. There may be examples from developed countries we can learn from. Any thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, look, you know, the situation at Murray is that a lot of the nutrient load coming into the lagoon is from wastewater, which sits within aquifers. There's relatively young aquifers, there's old aquifers, there's some that are draining quickly, there's some that are draining slowly, depending on where they are in the catchment. Without a doubt, there's going to be elevated nutrient loading into the lagoon for many years because it's already in the groundwater system, and that's how long it takes to move through. So the solutions, getting infrastructure in place, has got a certain time frame in itself, which you know, I'm not going to comment on what that may or may not be because that depends on a whole bunch of government processes. But even once that infrastructure is in place, there's a time frame for it to start having a significant impact and turning things around. And yes, there are examples, and yes, there's things that can be done to turn it around. And in my view, it's a combination of all of these things. We can't just focus on the long-term infrastructure improvements. There's other improvements in the short term and the medium term that also need to come together to help turn things around for Murray.
Thanks, Matt. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I was going to ask, and this does relate, there's one more question that's just popped up, and this relates to it actually. I was going to ask about the issues relating to, obviously the port and around Trader Jack's and those areas, there's quite a bit of hard infrastructure, and the airport as well that's been put there to protect it. And you touched on some of the issues that can occur if that gets moved around in cyclones. You know, what are some of the issues with hard infrastructure versus, you know, the pros and cons versus sort of replanting and trying to rebuild berm areas in that coastal foreshore zone?
Yeah, so there's a couple of elements to answering that question. Most of that land area between Trader Jack's, so Avarua Harbour and Avatu Harbour, the main port, that is mostly reclaimed land where the foreshore has actually been moved forward into the lagoon. And that in itself is somewhat of a strategy to create a buffer from waves impacting the coastline and where the main part of town is, and to put space that is at the moment roads in between those two things. So most of that is reclaimed land, which is, I guess, one of the main reasons why it's all been hardened. But I guess the important thing to realise is that a lot of these issues are the result of land elevation and the magnitude of waves and things coming through there. So even though it doesn't really matter what you're protecting the foreshore with, whether it's soft or hard, the inland areas of town range between sort of 1.8 and maybe 2.5, 3 meters above sea level, and storm surge levels are 3 meters above sea level, potentially more. And they're all connected. So regardless of what that foreshore looks like, you're going to have inundation and flooding for a lot of the area of town in a really big cyclone anyway. But certainly for areas like the port, there's not really soft protection measures that can cope with the kind of magnitude of cyclone waves that we have here. We have a real divide here between the magnitude of huge cyclone waves and the day-to-day wave events that are happening. And that's one of the reasons why we're in this situation with the risks the way it is. And it's also one of the reasons why there hasn't been a solution implemented for many years. And there's many reports that highlight these same risks, and all of them have recommended huge scale coastal protection along this north coast area. It's just infeasible to build something like that, which is why it's never happened. It would involve huge coastal protection structures out on the reef and this kind of thing to provide immunity from it. It's never happened, and it's infeasible that it would. So it's definitely got to be a combination of land use planning, perhaps protection of key assets, and a combined approach to coastal protection with some of those softer things as well.
Thanks, Matt. I think you've answered that last question in that answer as well. Michael's just popped one up. He's trying to squeeze one in before the hour. If a port and or trading, last one then, if a port and or trading vessels were out of action for say months due to storm surge, what would be the implications for the people of the Cooks? I imagine they're quite dependent on imports. Yes,
the implications are changing, but yes, they are. That port has the majority of importation to the Cooks, and yes, they're dependent on imports. Big challenges for it straight away is that port would be used as a part of recovery from a big cyclone like this. So that's my primary concern, is being able to get recovery equipment and infrastructure onto the island if it was needed. If the port is out of action, the airport probably would be as well, at least for a while. So at the moment, with the way the situation is at the moment. So managing some of those issues would be the immediate concern. Looking bigger picture over, a month or a couple of months, this is the risk that we're looking at, and that's why it's on the agenda as one of the, the port for one of the infrastructure improvements in that way. Things like fuel supply, aviation fuel supply, all come through that port. And up until, recent times, a lot of the energy production has been by diesel generators that all come through that port with diesel. So a lot of that has flow-on implications for all of those areas, even though there's a lot of solar now. A lot of the backup power supply is still diesel generated. So there's issues like that. Obviously, food and consumables as well. And that's a massive issue. So trying to keep the berths and the approach channel of the port and the navigation channel clear and the wharf functioning is a key priority.
Yeah. And Imogen's just said, most likely we will go back to using lighters to discharge boats, which is what happened before the ports were built.
Yeah, that's probably exactly what would have to happen to be able to at least temporarily get things off. But look, the plan is to have infrastructure like the port as low risk as possible in the bigger picture. That's the direction it's got to go. Yeah, you know, with climate change and that kind of thing, that's the direction it has to go.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate everyone joining us, and thanks very much to Matt for this very informative and you know, sort of like a tease with all those photos as well. They're a great presentation, but also making us want to travel. I will just say that we've got some more workshops coming up through the IGD. So we have, I think, 2 probably in October. We had to move the September one. So I think the next one is Adam Craig from the School of Public Health and Community Medicine. That's likely to be around mid-October, and we'll send invites out to our list about that. And you can certainly get in touch with the IGD at unsw.edu.au if you aren't already on that mailing list. And you can get in touch with us. Matt's email is also in the chat, which Kayla has put up. Thank you very much, Kayla. Adam's workshop coming up in October is on mosquito vectors and monitoring in the Solomon Islands. So that should be really interesting. I think looking at the climate change impacts on mosquito vectors and diseases like dengue fever and malaria. That should be very interesting. Well, it's great to have you, Matt, and thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you in the coming months, and do get in touch with us if you have further questions. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.